I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, this is one of the most unusual bills before Parliament this year. We don't often get to debate the potential future Chief of State of 16 different countries. But this is an important change for the New Zealand Constitution, and it's good that New Zealand First has had a chance to consider this constitutional change and debate it. It's very sad, of course, and utterly unacceptable that the consideration of other constitutional changes now being considered by the government, being those generated by the National Maori Party Confidence and Supply Agreement, have excluded New Zealand First. New Zealand First will support the Royal Succession Bill, but we have grave concerns about the constitutional changes being considered under the current process to implement the National Maori Party Agreement. Of great concern is the very biased makeup of the 12-member Constitutional and Advisory Panel, which is managing that process. There is also a cross-party reference group that does not include New Zealand First. The panel will make recommendations to Peter Sharples and Bill English, who are the responsible ministers, and then to Cabinet in November this year. These parties may then try to ram another constitutional bill through Parliament, and the issues to be discussed in that are much greater in weight than those we are currently considering this evening. They include a written constitution, the size of Parliament, the size and number of electorates, the length of the parliamentary term, Maori electorates, including the Maori electoral option, and other such.
We're on a bill that doesn't cover those points, so I'll ask the member to concentrate on the bill. He can mention those things, but it must relate to the substance of the bill. Dennis O'Rourke.
The reason, Mr Speaker, I am mentioning them is simply this, that we have much greater issues before us this year in terms of the New Zealand Constitution than we are dealing with this evening. And those constitutional changes are much greater weight than the Royal Succession Bill we are talking about this evening. And we in New Zealand First will be taking great note of those, including flawed concepts such as incorporating the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, whatever they are supposed to be. But, Mr Speaker, we will support the...
Order. The member will sit. Just remember that. I just mentioned that the member must concentrate on the bill. It's been 2.5 minutes, and we need to. The member must focus on what this bill is, and I'll ask the member to come back to it. Dennis O'Rourke.
Well, Mr Speaker, if you've given me a chance, I was just about to move on to that.
Sit down. Don't challenge the ruling of the chair or the speaker. If one wants to do that, I'll terminate the speech. Now, have 7.5 minutes going, and I'll ask the member to come back to the bill. Dennis O'Rourke.
I'm very happy to come back to the bill because that's what I was about to do anyway. And, Mr Speaker, we will be supporting the Royal Succession Bill. It implements changes to the Royal Succession agreed by 16 realms of which the Queen is sovereign. These changes do modernise historic Royal Succession rules, firstly by ensuring that the royal succession is not dependent on a person's sex, and also allows an older daughter to precede a younger son in the line of succession. In other words, it abolishes the archaic concept of primogeniture. Regardless of when the bill is enacted, it will apply for all royal births after midnight on 28 October 2011. Mr Speaker, the bill also removes the current restrictions that bar from the throne people married to a Roman Catholic. These barriers can no longer be justified, but the change will apply to all marriages where the person concerned is alive, thereby reinstating some people into the line of succession. But of course, there is no change to the law under which the monarch must be a member of and the head of the Church of England. And in this respect, the law will remain discriminatory. That is not appropriate in this day and age, and ought also to change. But we in New Zealand First accept that New Zealand alone cannot achieve this while we retain the constitutional monarchy, which we share with 15 other countries. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, the bill abolishes the requirement of the Royal Marriages Act 1772 that all descendants of King George II must seek the sovereign's consent to marry. It also introduces a new requirement that the first 6 people in line to the throne must seek the sovereign's consent to marry. And there are likely to be hundreds of descendants of King George II who were or are unaware of the marriage consent requirements of the Royal Marriages Act 1772 and whose marriages are therefore technically invalid. The bill therefore also validates the relevant earlier marriages for the purposes other than royal succession. So for that reason also, New Zealand First is happy to support the bill. And while New Zealand First does support the bill, we do so without approving the continuation of religious discrimination in the way the monarch is still required to adhere to under current arrangements. We also, Mr. Speaker, await with interest the more substantive changes to the New Zealand Constitution, which I suspect will be foisted upon us later this year.
I call Alfred Naro.
Mr. Speaker, I rise and take a call on the Royal Succession Bill in its first reading. Its purpose is very clear, and again it's heartening to hear that both New Zealand First and Labour are also supporting this to select committee where there will be robust debate. There are issues that do need to be discussed and talked about. This bill changes the restrictions around royal concession to make them better reflect today's modern values while still